Good afternoon and happy Friday. We are live from the NASDAQ market site in Times Square as a part of our ongoing series, NASDAQ Reads, featuring books and written works that exhibit innovation, entrepreneurship, and startup themes that any business can leverage. And joining us today for a special interview, we have New York Times best-selling author Martin Lindstrom, who is the author of Small Data, The Tiny Clues That Uncover Huge Trends. The book reveals how seemingly insignificant details of human behavior can point a careful observer to the next big trend. Martin, welcome to NASDAQ.
Thank you, Brad.
Absolutely. So just diving right in, what is small data?
Well, small data is really the opposite of big data, where big data is all about tons of numbers where you try to find a correlation. Small data is all about the hypothesis, which you really need to figure out what are you searching for when you have the big data. So you can say that's all about the causation. And that is the issue we have today. All companies are now jumping on the big data trend, but they have no hypothesis, and that's really small data.
So what's an example then of a company that's turned around its strategies and focusing more on small data?
Well, I think a good example would be Lego. We all know Lego today as a huge success story, but winding back 13 years to 2003, that's a huge problem. In fact, Lego relied partly on big data, and those data told the company that the instant gratification generation had arrived, meaning they had no patience whatsoever to play with those Lego bricks. So Lego did a historic move to change those tiny bricks into gigantic building blocks. And during Christmas 2003, guess what happened? The company was close to bankruptcy. In fact, the revenue went down 30%. Now, that was the moment where a small group in Lego decided to move in with consumers and start to pick up small data. And this is a true story. They end up in a home of an 11-year-old German kid. And they ask him one simple question: what are you most proud of? Right. And this kid looks around, he points at a shelf, and there you have an old pair of worn-down sneakers. And of course, Lego is surprised. They thought he would say a Nintendo, PlayStation or something, right? Didn't. So they ask him why, and he says, well, because when you are skateboarding, you are sliding down this skateboard at a certain angle, and it creates an exact wear and tear on my sports shoes. Yeah. And I'm the #1 skater in town, and this is my evidence because it has exactly that angle. And really, that was his trophy, and that was the moment where Lego realized that time is not in essence with kids if they are put in the driver's seat, because suddenly they want to fine-tune things to the extreme. Yeah. So Lego went back to the drawing board, they changed the size of the Lego bricks back to the tiny ones, added even more, and later on the process of the Lego movie and a lot of other stuff happened, and today they're #1.
That's very interesting that you bring up the movie, because this took them in a kind of completely different direction than where they were in just the packaging up of their product and, telling the story through those different boxing and all of the packaging that they would do. Yeah. In your research, and I know this is kind of going off script a little bit, but in your research, did some of that small data influence their decision to kind of go in a media direction, creating motion pictures, things like that?
Well, absolutely, because here's the issue. What we've learned from a lot of our research over the years is that kids really don't have a lot of fantasy anymore, and fantasy needs to be infused into products. Sure. That means when you get a box of Legos, you want to be kicked into a right direction so you can sort of get that storyline going. Right. And certainly what small data have pointed out throughout the entire last 15 years is that if you can infuse stories into things, then suddenly there's a different, well, guess what? The Lego movie and a lot of the other activities Lego have done is all about infusing stories into it. So yes, absolutely, this is a good indication. And guess what? I have to say it. Big data was never able to pick this thing up. And that is the problem I think companies have today. They rely too much on the big data and completely forget about the counterbalance.
So what then has big data done to the boardrooms? Like, can you give an example of a company that may be relying too much on big data, perhaps?
Well, let me give you 2 examples. I mean, one example is a major bank here in the US, which just recently realized through big data they were losing a lot of clients. And they could see that there was a lot of churn. People are moving around with their bank accounts. They didn't know why. So they prepared a range of different letters to send out to millions of customers, basically saying to them, hey, we see there's a problem. We want to cut the interest rate just to keep you. Now, guess what? A couple of days before they're shipping out these letters, one guy say, hey, should we ask those customers?
Yeah.
So they go out, they ask them, they start to pick up those small data, and they realize the reason why people are in this flux is because most of them are going through a divorce.
Wow.
And really, what they're doing is to separate accounts. They're not leaving, but they're leaving because there's no product to handle this.
Right.
So really, they completely oversee things. This is a good example, but if you take the somewhat competitor to Facebook, Google is another example. In 2012, they were the first to predict a flu outbreak here in the United States,
Wow.
5 or 6 days in advance, based on search algorithms. They basically were saying if you type in flu, they can sort of predict, there's an outbreak in North Carolina or whatever. However, just recently, the Center for Disease Control announced that they were completely wrong. In fact, the numbers were 2 times what they should have been. Now, why is that? Because I type in flu, my kids are seeing it, they type in flu, and suddenly, actually, this thing become viral. So they relied on the cost, so the correlation, because they really were just looking at the bare numbers, where they forgot about the causation.
Right. So then what can small data found in, we're looking at all of the different things, and one of the resounding themes I think that you touched on right there is the fact that there's also a family impact in that small data kind of correlation. So for instance, what can be found, in a family's refrigerator that correlates to small data?
Well, this is fascinating. If we take Facebook as an example, right? I would claim that most people, sorry for saying this, but I would claim that most people of you out there are lying on your Facebook account, right? Because we pretend like who we are. We're a little bit better looking, a little bit more sexy, and we also have a better CV. But the reality is, just as we build up our brand online, we actually have a perception room at home. The perception room you find when you're looking for the coffee table book, that is a perception room. And listen to this, it's crazy. People would have huge, colorful paintings hanging in the perception room tend to be more self-confident. And this is crazy what I'm telling you now. People would have a huge bookshelf in the perception room, packed with books, tend to have a lower education. We are kind of compensating for the lack of education by stacking books into our life. If you have a lot of antiques, we now know that it means that you want to come across as being more sophisticated. All those seemingly insignificant observations, what I call emotional DNA, will leave behind ourselves, like the fridge. If I stack the fridge in a certain way, it talks about my inner conflict. Vegetables on top, the regular Coke on the bottom, hidden. It talks about my conflicts. And what is fascinating about all this is it all tells about who we really are, because you can't really talk about human beings defining it just by numbers. I mean, you wouldn't define your partner using just numbers, right?
2, 3, 5, 7.
Yeah, it turns me on, right? You really want to go the opposite way and say, well, no, this person is like this and that. And that is the issue where I think we are forgetting now. If we really want to connect with consumers, we need the true small data to define it. And a good example is Walmart. Yeah. I mean, Walmart has, listen to this, it's crazy. They have the biggest data warehouse in the world, supposedly double the size of FBI's database.
Wow.
Now, they know a lot about customers, yet the #1 complaint they're receiving is that they don't understand customers because they don't understand the emotional side. They don't understand the small data.
Right. So using that model that you just mentioned, jumping back to how your home is laid out. So if I were to say I have a very minimalist home, not a whole lot of things on the wall, I've got the things that I need to get by. Would you then flip that and say, okay, this is somebody who's overcompensating because they lead a very perhaps exhausting life and they're looking for something to simplify their emotions when they get home? Is that accurate using that model?
Well, depending on the context, but yes. What's accurate is that what is missing is telling just as much about the person as what you see. Okay. And it's important to understand that we all leave these seemingly insignificant observations or clues behind ourselves, and it is really an extension of our personality. So for example, if you have a huge bunch of keys hanging from your pants, well, actually, we know today it tells about you trying to sort of come across as being a little bit more important. I'll tell you a funny story. I was staying at a fancy hotel in Switzerland the other day, and this guy, he owns this $500 million property, and they all have automatic doors and all this stuff, yet the owner has this huge bunch of keys he's running around with. Right. And when I asked later on the staff, how confident is this guy? They said he's not very confident, and you saw that in the keys. So I think it's important to understand everything tells a story, and what companies are missing is they think they can run the consumer on a remote control.
Yeah.
You can't. You have to get into the reality, pick up those small data, get your hands dirty, and start a movement where you get closer to the consumer, because right now we have a big distance, and probably it's too big.
Okay, so thinking about that and the small pieces of data, it doesn't get much smaller than an emoticon. So bringing it back to kind of the digital realm, I mean, what would people's emoticons, the ones that they use?
This is crazy. I'm so glad you're bringing this up, because you can actually encapsulate the entire nation based on a piece of small data. If you take Russia, I mean, they're not well known for smiling too much, right? The #1 emojicon used by most Russians is the heart.
Wow.
The #1 emoji in Saudi Arabia, where there's not a lot of greenery, is a plant. The #1 in UK, where they have this quirky, funny, strange, I don't understand it, humor, right, is the wink. Wow. The #1 emojicon in Australia is, and I know the Australian people will hate me for this one here, is because they take a lot of drugs. It is actually the pill.
Wow.
The #1 emoji, I was just in Korea last week at the annual business forum for all the Asian leaders. And we did research into emojis in Korea. Now they work day and night. It's probably the hardest working population in the world. Guess what? It's a sad crying face. So you can actually squeeze an entire population into one symbol, but of course you also need to understand the meaning behind it. But this is the message. Even the way you type today, if you pause in the way you're typing, tells about your mood. If you use caps, it tells about your credit card rating. All that stuff is what we're trying to pick up using small data.
Sure, and so it's interesting that you bring up the credit card side of things, so we do have to talk a little bit of finance since we're here at NASDAQ. But what would you say that small data may reveal about people's spending habits, perhaps?
Well, a lot. I'll give you some crazy insight here. For example, a very well-known credit card company in this country, in fact, have found out that the small cushions you put underneath the legs on a chair, you know those one protecting your floor? You've probably never seen them at home,
right?
No,
I remember them.
Your parents had it?
Of course. I had to help them put it on it.
Bradley. So what's happening is when people buy that more, because that has a certain reference number in the credit card system, right? When people buy that, they are the most accurate payers right now.
Right.
So you actually can take a little piece of purchase people are buying and actually translate that into how likely are people to pay later on. Or, for example, as we talked about before, if you use caps, you use lowercase, you have certain spelling errors, it can actually determine your credit card rating with up to 72% accuracy. Do not have spelling errors.
Don't have any spelling errors.
Stay away from that. But this is the issue. We are not aware of it, how we are broadcasting center of emotions. And I think what we need to come to terms with is to understand the world is not just about a ton of data. The world is all about zooming in on one little piece and understand the human side. And that's really what I'm trying to do in the book Small Data, right?
That's perfect. So just before we wrap, where can people find your book Small Data? Where can they pick it up? How do we get our hands on copies?
Well, no, you can find it in most indie bookstores in the United States, of course, on the usual Amazon. You can find it on martinlindstrom.com, and of course, Facebook, right? You can find me on facebook.com/martinlindstrom, or on Twitter, if I may say that one as well. So,
we'll let it slide.
Yeah, sorry about that. So you can basically find me everywhere. Small data, tiny clues that reveal huge trends.
Awesome. Now, we have a copy actually that's here. Can I get you to sign one?
Yeah, of course you can.
For a friend of mine, maybe?
Of course you can.
Her name is Adina.
Adina?
Yeah.
Thanks a lot.
Absolutely.
Thanks.
Thank you.